When I was 31, I met a man who told me one of the most spectacular stories I've ever heard. I'll tell it to you the best I can remember. But I must admit, more than 25 years have passed since I first heard it. It is possible that some of the details may have changed over the years. During my first trip to Japan, I leaned against the window of a bus as it climbed the base of Mount Fuji. About 15 other people and I departed from Tokyo 2 hours prior, with our sights set on climbing the highest mountain in Japan. As I stared out the window, I couldn't see much. There were branches, thick shrubs growing along the side of the road, illuminated in the headlights. But the other details of the mountain were hidden by nighttime. I closed my eyes and listened to the engine roar as the gradient grew steeper. I must admit, I wasn't the most athletic person in the world, so I was a little worried about the climb. The overhead lights flashed on when the bus reached the base camp about 6,000 feet up the mountain. The other passengers on the bus began gathering their possessions. I could recognize at least 4 languages being spoken: Japanese, French, Spanish, and German. Many of the other hikers carried poles and wore hiking shoes and wind-proof clothing. I wondered if my worn-out running shoes and jeans would get me to the top of the mountain. We filtered off the bus one by one. When it was my turn, I paused to let the man across from me slide out first. He had a white and gray goatee and a heavily wrinkled face. If I had to guess, I would say he was at least in his 70s. He smiled at me and pointed toward the aisle. "After you," he said in a thick Japanese accent. I stepped off the bus and onto the side of the mountain. The volcanic rock crunched beneath my feet as I walked toward the gift shop next to the bus. As I went inside, I checked my watch. There was still half an hour until I had to start the climb. I heard that making it to the top in time for sunrise would be one of the most beautiful moments of my life. I didn't want to leave too late, but I also didn't want to arrive hours early and be stuck waiting at the top. I killed about 15 minutes in the gift shop looking at the various souvenirs. They had magnets, postcards, stuffed animals dressed in kimonos, and row after row of hand-carved chopsticks. There was a small cafe joined to the gift shop, and I could smell the earthy scent of barley tea brewing. I purchased a cup of tea and sat with it near the window. Soft lute music played from a speaker above me. I felt so relaxed that I was worried that I would fall asleep before I even started climbing. After a moment, the old man I met on the bus wandered over to me with a cup held between his hand. "May I sit here?" he asked. "Of course," I said. The man sat across from me and placed his teacup on the table. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. We sat with our hands folded in our laps as we watched the steam gently rise off the tea. Even though we were halfway up the mountain already, it was so dark that all I could see in the window was our reflections. "What brings you to Japan?" asked the man eventually. It was a good question, and I wished that I had a good answer for him. To be honest, I had probably come for the same reason as many of the hundreds of thousands of people who came to climb Mount Fuji each year. I had quit my stable but mundane job as a bank branch manager. Now I was traveling the world and trying to figure out what I wanted before settling into a career. What better place to have a spiritual awakening than the land of the rising sun? "I'm searching for something," I said. The man nodded as if he understood perfectly. "I climb the mountain every year," he said. "And every year I meet someone who has come for a similar reason." We finished our tea, and I wished him safe travels on his hike before we parted ways. He told me his name was Haruto, and I said it aloud to help me remember it. I left the gift shop and searched for the trail that led up the mountain. A series of signs and arrows led me to the start. I dug a flashlight out of my backpack and turned it on so I could see the reddish-gray soil at my feet. For the first half hour of my journey, lights illuminated the sides of the trail and zigzagged up the side of the mountains before disappearing behind the clouds far above me. The beginning of the hike was relatively easy since the gradient was gradual and the trail was made from thickly packed soil. But after climbing for an hour, I started to feel lightheaded from the altitude. I stopped to sit on a rock and ate the first of the snacks I had brought. I chewed on a sticky white rice cake with a sweet red bean filling as I waited for my body to adapt to the altitude. After a couple minutes, I saw a man wearing a puffy blue jacket coming up the mountain. When he got closer, I recognized him as Haruto. He held a narrow flashlight in his left hand and rested his other hand at the base of his spine. He smiled when he saw me. "This mountain is too easy for you," I said. "I've climbed it many times," he said. "I know how to time myself." He sat next to me and dug a plastic container from his bag filled with slices of a white Asian pear. He offered me a slice. I bit into it with a crunch and let the sweet taste linger on my tongue. I looked upward to where the lights at the side of the trail reached the clouds. I heard rumors that the mountain could erupt at any moment. He followed my eyes to the clouds and laughed. "It's not going to erupt," he said. "It could," I insisted. "It hasn't erupted in more than 300 years. Maybe it's due." The man batted a hand and laughed again. "It's not going to erupt. Don't you know the legend of the mountain?" I shook my head. I had read several stories about the mountain before my trip, but I couldn't remember the details of any of them. It also seemed more interesting to hear them recounted by this man than to read them in a book. The man cleared his throat and began weaving his tale. "A long time ago, there was a village at the base of this mountain. The village was where the many young samurai warriors refined their skills before heading to battle. Even though the village was small, warriors would travel from as far as Hokkaido for the chance to train at the base of Mount Fuji with some of the area's most well-known samurai masters. But the people in the village had a problem. As powerful as the warriors were, even they were scared of the dragon named Kemuri living inside the mountain. The dragon was so large that his body was as thick around as the crater at the mountain's peak. When he stuck his serpentine head out of the top of the mountain, the bottom of his tail would dangle near the base, 12,000 feet below. The dragon had lived in the mountain far longer than the people had been there. Usually, they lived harmoniously together, but recently, the dragon started causing problems. Once a week, the mighty dragon would rise from the lair and blow a flame high in the sky. Each time the dragon erupted, the sky filled with ash and black clouds that blocked the sun. All around the village were soybean and rice fields. Most years, the crops were lush and sparkled like emerald in the sunlight. But now, the plants were wilting, and the villagers were in danger of not having enough food to get them through the winter. Someone had to talk to the dragon and to tell him to stop covering the sky with smoke. Haruto paused his story. I will tell you the rest later. We need to start climbing again. If we don't start moving soon, we might not get to the top in time. As much as I enjoyed his story, I was reluctant to climb together. I assumed that he would slow me down. He appeared to be close to 80 years old after all. But he said that he had climbed the mountain many times. He probably had a better idea than me how long it would take to make it to the top. When we started our ascent again, I walked in front of him. Every minute or so, I had to wait for him to catch up to me as he continued at a casual pace with one hand tucked behind his back. After half an hour of climbing, I was panting heavily, and my legs had begun shaking. But Haruto didn't show any signs of fatigue. Even when he recited facts to me about certain landmarks of the mountain, he spoke without a hint of being out of breath. Do you want to hear more of the story? He asked. I took a moment to calm my heavy breathing before answering, so he wouldn't be able to tell how out of shape I was. Yes, tell me the next part of the story, I said. It will take my mind off the climb. The village elders had a meeting to decide what to do about the dragon. It seemed like they only had one option. The bravest warrior in the village would have to climb to the top of Mount Fuji and slay the dragon. They debated among themselves who the bravest warrior in the village was. Eventually, they decided that it was Komatsu Hisaki, a samurai warrior with more than 25 years of battle experience. The village elders asked Komatsu if he would slay the dragon for them. He laughed and told them that it wouldn't be a problem. When he was a young man, he had fought off an entire army single-handedly, so one dragon did not scare him. In the morning, Komatsu began climbing the mountain with a sword hanging from his belt, and his eyes set on the clouds above him. It took him most of the day to make it to the top from the village. When he reached the summit, he looked into the crater and called Kimuri's name. The dragon wound its serpentine body upward through the crater and stared at the warrior. His breath smelled like charcoal, and as he breathed, his whiskers fluttered on either side of his mouth like ribbons. Komatsu withdrew his sword and held it in front of the massive beast. "I am here to slay you, fireworm," he shouted. The dragon tilted its head into the air, blew flames high into the sky, and roared so loudly he could be heard halfway across the continent. The samurai dropped his sword and ran as fast as he could down the side of the mountain until he returned to the village. Haruto and I paused to eat again and let our bodies adjust to the altitude. I felt a little dizzy from the thin air, and my stomach growled loudly as I unwrapped a rice ball. The clouds seemed to be hovering only a few feet above us. This afternoon, when I was waiting at Shinjuku Station for the bus to the mountain, it was nearly 30 degrees. Now, I shivered beneath my jacket. It couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 degrees. The thick mist surrounding us felt cool against my skin, and I could see the water droplets in the beam of my flashlight. Haruto broke off half an orange and passed it to me. I had never tasted an orange so fresh. The juice was sweet, and I savored each bite. When we stood again, my legs wobbled beneath me. I didn't know how much further we had to hike, but I was worried that my legs would give out on me before we made it to the top. "What did the villagers do next?" I asked Haruto, who still didn't seem fazed by the climb. The next evening, the village elders had another meeting to discuss what could be done about the dragon. The sky was darker than ever, and if they didn't do something soon, they wouldn't have enough food to get through the winter. They decided to send the second bravest person to the top of the mountain to slay the dragon. The next morning, Samurai Izumi Kinmochi started his journey to the top of the mountain. Izumi had not been tested in battle as much as Komatsu, but he was known as one of the bravest warriors across Japan. When he got to the top of Mount Fuji, he called out Kimuri's name like the first warrior had. The dragon slithered out of the crater at the summit and stuck his head out. Black smoke streamed out of his nostrils. The dragon growled, and Izumi dropped his sword. Before the dragon even had time to blow his embers into the sky, Izumi started running as fast as he could. When he returned to the village without his sword, the elders began to panic. If the two bravest men in the village couldn't slay the beast, there must not have been anybody who could protect them from Kimuri. Haruto and I paused for a third and final time before reaching the summit. I still couldn't see the top of the mountain, but I had a feeling that it wasn't far. I quickly devoured a handful of dates I had bought that morning in Tokyo, and I rubbed my tired legs. The old man still didn't seem tired. In fact, I had a feeling that he was picking up energy the higher we hiked, whereas every muscle in my body ached. "Are you ready?" he asked after several moments. I nodded, and we set off on the last leg of our journey. By then, I was so tired that I was using both my hands to push against my thighs with each step. I called out to Haruto, "You better tell me the rest of the story. If I don't have anything to take my mind off the mountain, I might not make it." He laughed and cleared his throat. While the elders were discussing what to do with the dragon, the daughter of one of the village samurai warriors stood in the doorway and listened. She was only 8 years old, but even she could tell that the village would be in trouble if the dragon wasn't stopped. Unlike the two samurai who had scaled the mountain, she decided that she would talk to the dragon and ask him why he was covering the sky with smoke. Later that night, when her parents were asleep, she filled a bag with balls of rice and fish before setting off on her journey. It took her 2 days to make it to the top. When she reached the summit, she called Kimuri's name. The dragon slithered out at the top of the mountain in the same way it did when the first two warriors approached. The dragon swiveled its head toward the girl until she could feel the heat coming from the dragon's nostrils. "Oh, great Kimuri," she said, "I have come to ask you why you are covering our village with smoke." The dragon grunted and told the girl that he had a thorn stuck between his teeth. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't get it out. The girl picked up the sword that Izumi had left behind and told Kimuri to open his mouth. The dragon spread his humongous jaw. He had an entire cherry tree sticking between his front teeth. Even the roots and leaves were still attached. The girl used the sword, and somehow, by a miracle, she managed to nudge the tree out of Kimuri's mouth. The dragon let out a loud sigh of relief and thanked the girl for her help. "Will you stop covering the sky with smoke now?" she asked him. The dragon told the girl that he was going back to his lair under the mountain for a long nap. He might be asleep for 10,000 years or more. The girl returned to the village to spread the good news. By the time she made it back to her home, the black clouds from the dragon were already starting to clear from the sky. The villagers lifted the girl onto their shoulders and celebrated their new freedom. To this day, the people in that village celebrate the day the dragon returned to sleep by throwing handfuls of cherry blossoms into the wind. "I'm glad to hear the story had a happy ending," I said. Finally, after 6.5 hours of climbing, the mountain leveled out. I couldn't see much in the darkness, but I could make out the outline of hundreds of people bundled under blankets and drinking tea from thermoses. I sat with Haruto on the edge of the mountain as we watched the sunrise over the clouds. It started with a faint orange glow along the edge of the clouds. As the top of the sun came into view, the orange glow replaced the purplish tint of the night sky. The sky transitioned into a spectacular shade of pink before finally transforming into the yellow of the early morning. I took a deep breath as we continued to watch the sunrise. I had come a long way to see this beautiful sight. I still didn't know what I wanted to do with my career, but for the moment, I felt at peace. There were no birds, there were no clouds, there were no plants. It felt like we were sitting at the top of the world. Seeing the beautiful sight made me sure that everything would work out. I closed my mind and took another deep breath as the sun warmed my face.